Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Hey guys, welcome to episode 29 of Seamwork Radio. And today we're talking about sewing affirmations. So the term affirmations might sound a little bit hokey to some of you, or maybe a little bit self-helpy, but I think if you think about it, we all have these things that we say to ourselves over and over, things that are good and helpful and things that are not so helpful. And so the idea here is that coming up with a few helpful things that you can remember when you get stuck or you're having a problem can really help you to just encourage yourself to keep going. So today we're going to cover what an affirmation is, how they work, and then share some ideas for creating your own when you need to get unstuck. So Haley, I found that one of the worst things for me with my creativity in just about any area, whether it's sewing or anything else that I'm doing creatively, is negative self-talk. So talking to myself in a negative way. And I just feel like when you're making something, no matter what it is, you're kind of in this vulnerable place. And so that's why negative self-talk can be just so destructive. And we were talking about this earlier, and we both said that we try to be really mindful of the way we talk to ourselves. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And how do you stay mindful when it comes to self-talk?
I think this is something that's a constant pursuit. I think that it's kind of a constant pursuit in just staying present in your thoughts. For me, it's also staying really present in my body. I find that I hold like a lot of negativity and stress physically in my body, as a lot of us do. So really taking the time to slow down when I'm especially in a creative state is what helps me make sure that I can be mindful of the thoughts that are kind of going in and out of my head, and making sure that I'm being as gentle to myself as I would with another person.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you mentioned the body. I think that's something that we overlook a lot. I remember I heard once that emotions are just something that you experience in your body. It's just a sensation in your body. And that's always been really, really helpful to me, just thinking about, how can I break down this feeling into what's actually happening in real life and really tune into that?
Totally. I find that sometimes I almost become more aware of something physically in my body before I become mentally aware of it. A good example is maybe controversially, I really dislike the Eagles. Hey, I hate the Eagles, but they're like a band that plays a lot. Like you hear their music a lot at like grocery stores or like wherever you go. Sometimes I'll like be like rolling on through the produce section. I'll like find myself so tense in my shoulders. I'm like, what the heck? And then I'm like, oh, it's Hotel California is really, I don't know what it is. I just find it really grating. But that's an example of like, I find that I physically acknowledge the stress sometimes before I mentally acknowledge it.
I hate the Eagles, man.
Yeah. Me and the dude have that in common.
What about the way you talk to yourself? Do you feel like how do you connect those two things?
Your relationship with yourself is the longest relationship that you will have in your life. So I try to treat myself like I would a friend. I think that a lot of times in our worst moments, we can be more harsh to ourselves than we would be to like even someone we didn't like. And so, yeah, I just treat myself like when I find myself in that negative spiral, like, would I say that to my BFF? Heck no. What about you?
Yeah, this is something that I feel like it's a skill that I've had to learn. I don't think that it came that naturally to me to just be nice to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I've gotten better and better at over time with conscious effort. And that's why I think something like affirmations, as kind of hokey as it might sound to some people, having these, I don't know if you would call them rules or practices that you use to re-emphasize behavior that you want to cultivate in yourself, it's just been really, really helpful to me. So that's just something I've had to really work at, and having a few kind of things to keep in mind has been super, super helpful to me. And I think over, especially the last year or two, I've really learned a lot about this. There's a book that really helped me with this. It's called Mindful Self-Compassion by Dr. Kristen Neff. And she specializes in this particular area of psychology. And I would highly recommend that for anybody else who kind of struggles with just being nice to yourself on a daily basis.
Oh, I might need that. We'll have to put that in the show notes for people to check out.
Yeah.
So we keep on talking about positive affirmations, but I think we need to back the truck up and define what this is for people who maybe aren't as familiar. So what is a positive affirmation?
I'd say a positive affirmation is any set of words that you use, a phrase that you use to counter negative or destructive thoughts. So it's something that you can use when you kind of have this, when you notice yourself, going back to the body and noticing what your emotions are, when you notice yourself maybe beating yourself up or having difficulty or just suffering in some way, it's something that you can turn to using language to counter what you're feeling, not counter what you're feeling. You should, you should accept what you're feeling, but to counter the thought spiral that's causing it.
I think too that it's of course countering those negative feelings, but also rewiring our brains to pursue those more positive thought pathways. I think that positive affirmations can get really wrapped up in this toxic positivity kind of culture. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that having negative feelings is okay.
Right.
And that's healthy. Those serve a purpose. It's you're okaying the feeling, but you're reframing it to be a more positive, a more positive thought. So maybe when I'm telling myself oh gosh, I suck at sewing invisible zippers, I will never be able to master this. Instead of that, I can reframe it as, okay, well, I haven't sewn an invisible zipper in a while. I should probably reference some materials next time. That's not an example of a positive affirmation, but more of just you can have the feeling and feel cruddy in the feeling, but use it to move you forward in a positive way instead of just dwelling on the negativity.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I've learned over time is that the negative feeling itself is totally natural. It's totally normal. And it's not something that you need to fight with. But there's the initial thought, and then there's how you respond to the thought afterwards. And that's where I think tools like affirmations and other tools can come in and help you to deal with what's going on, not to ignore it.
So, I'm crunchy, but also like science. So, is there evidence that positive affirmations actually do anything?
So I looked this up and I found this article in Positive Psychology. So we'll link to it in the show notes as well about the theory behind positive affirmations and how it actually works. So the idea behind it is something called self-affirmation theory. And what that says is that we create this narrative about ourselves, and that's called our self-identity. And that's the story that we tell about ourselves. And maintaining a healthy self-identity is not really about believing that we're perfect, but it's about believing that we're good enough in the areas that we personally value. And so the way affirmations work is that you maintain that sense of identity by living up to the story that you're telling yourself. And then you start acting in accordance with it. So if you tell yourself that you are, for example, a kind person, your self-identity kind of tricks you into wanting to actually behave that way because that's what you've been telling yourself. So that's kind of the idea behind how affirmations work in practice.
Yeah. Sounds legit.
We'll link to that article so people can read a little bit more about it, though.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So, do you have any sayings or affirmations that you like to use?
I have a few. So we asked this question. I asked this question on the community a while ago. And the one I mentioned there is, I don't know if you would even call it an affirmation, but it's just a quote that I really like from one of my favorite writers, Angela Carter. And it says, "Nothing is a matter of life and death except life and death." And that's always something that grounds me. Just remember that there's a bigger timeline here. Like there are other things that are more important than whatever this latest catastrophe is in your day. So that's always something that's been very helpful to me, and it's kind of something I've had in my back pocket for a few years. And then another thing that's been helpful to me, and this is more recent and maybe a little bit more practical, maybe, but when I was reading some of the material from that book, Mindful Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff, this is one of her practices. That book has a whole bunch of different practices that you can use. And one of them is that when you have a difficulty or you're experiencing difficult emotions, that you just stop, and there's a couple phrases that she recommends, which is, it's something along the lines of, you can kind of modify it to suit yourself, but something along the lines of, this is a moment of suffering. So you start by acknowledging that this is a moment of suffering. And then everybody suffers. So then you acknowledge that this is something that you share with everyone else in the world. And then the last phrase is, may I be kind to myself in this moment. And that brings the self-compassion back to yourself. And that's been really, really helpful to me, even with like really minor problems in my day, where I just start kind of like blowing things way out of proportion when it's not such a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
That's just like a way to take a reflective moment and stop and just remember to be nice to yourself. So that's been super, super helpful to me.
Yeah.
What about you?
I would say I'm probably more of a just like positive self-talk person than an affirmations person, but there is a saying that I kind of repeat to myself very often when I'm sewing. And I've also realized in the last couple of years, it's probably applicable to lots of things in life. So I had this tailoring instructor when I was in school for fashion design. Her name was Miss Monty. Shout out to Miss Monty. I was taking this tailoring class, and I was I think I was doing some like pad stitching or something. And I was just like really wrestling with this thing. And she came up to me and she's like, Haley, you just need to learn when to use your baby hands and when to use your trucker hands. And I think of this all the time. When I'm having a moment of frustration, am I frustrating myself by the approach I'm taking? Do I need to take a gentler approach? Do I need to be more firm? I mean, this is like applicable when you're like, wrestling a quilt through a sewing machine or trying to do a baby hem on some silk chiffon, but it's also applicable when you're dealing with personal relationships. Is a gentle approach appropriate here? Is that going to save me some grief? Or do I need to stand up for myself and really stand by my boundaries? It's just something that I repeat to myself that really keeps me mindful of the way that I'm reacting to situations. So I guess it's more of an affirmative practice
Mm-hmm.
and, accompanying saying.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? A lot of these sayings that kind of come from craft or the idea of craftsmanship can really be applicable to the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like I just think of the phrase like measure twice, cut once.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that, people say in woodworking, and, you can apply it to sewing, but you can also apply it to your entire life. If you stop and think before you act, then the acting becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, totally. Sewing has taught me so much patience, so much self-compassion. And I think that I'm probably a better person for it. Not that I'm better than people who don't sew, but like I'm a better version of myself because of sewing.
I'm so much better than everybody else.
Oh, it's hard to be me. Um, okay, so I like to pride myself on being like a healthy mix of crunchy and science, but I want to acknowledge the people who might be listening and totally gagging at the term affirmation. Do you have any advice
Yeah,
for these people?
I don't love it either,
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
honest. I think it sounds kind of like, that SNL skit with Al Franken and Stuart Smalley, where he faces himself in the mirror and says, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough.
Yeah.
That's what comes to mind when I think of the term affirmations. It's not actually a term I would use. Like I just think of it as, a helpful phrase or a tool that I have. It's not, I think you can call it whatever you want, but I just think of it as kind of a saying, or yeah, I guess just a tool, just like any other. And it doesn't have to have that connotation if that's the connotation that you associate it with the term affirmations.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not like a person who wakes up every morning and like, says these types of things to myself in the mirror. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I think that if it brings you peace and happiness, it enhances your life, then you do you. That's amazing. But I think that it's just, for me, more about that positive self-talk and being kind to myself.
Yeah, for me, it's more of something that I have on hand when things seem to be going wrong, rather
Mhm.
than kind of a daily thing that I do. Although I know some people might incorporate it into, their daily rituals, their, maybe part of their meditation practice, or
Mhm.
whatever they do, and I think that's cool too. But for me, it's more just something that I can use when I need it.
Totally. A tool, indeed. So we also have, this was a discussion, like we said earlier, in the Seamart community. And we wanted to share a few of our favorites from there. The first one being, it's better to put it down than to rush it. Heck yes. I have kind of a personal sewing rule that if I've seam ripped the same thing 2 times in a row, then it's time to take a break.
Yeah.
And this is definitely reminiscent of that practice. Slow and steady wins the race. Classic.
Mm-hmm.
We also have done is better than none, or done is beautiful. I like these ones a lot.
Yeah, those are nice.
And lastly, progress, not perfection.
Yeah, I kind of like I know some of these might sound to some people kind of like cliches, but I think a cliche in this instance can be really helpful because it's easy to remember. It's something you've heard a lot. And I think that makes it I think that would make it helpful for some people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, these are like things that if I was like sewing with a child, I would tell them this, and I aspire to treat myself with the same kindness that I would treat a child with.
That's a good way to think about it. So I want to talk about a few tips for kind of coming up with your own if you feel like this is something that would be helpful to you. So I've got a few tips here. I think the first thing that's been helpful to me in developing a tool like this is just thinking about where I get stuck. So what are the places where I seem to have issues over and over, or there's just this lesson that I seem to have to learn multiple times, just over and over. And if that's the case, maybe there's something you can remind yourself of that will help you to get unstuck from those types of situations. So that's just kind of like noticing a pattern in your life or in your behavior, in your creativity, in your sewing, and recognizing that, acknowledging that, and then figuring out a tool that can help you. That's the first tip. I think that could be the first good step for coming up with something like this. And then the second tip is, what do you value about sewing that you want to live up to? So going back to what we were saying earlier from that positive psychology article, you're constructing this story for yourself about the kind of person you want to be, or the kind of creative person, or the kind of sewer that you want to be. So what is that person that you want to live up to? Maybe it's somebody who values quality over quantity, or who is able to take things slow and really enjoy the process rather than just trying to make more and more stuff or accumulate more things. So what's that story? And then can you craft some kind of phrase around that just to remind yourself about what you're really aiming for? So those are my first two. And then the third one, if you're having trouble coming up with an affirmation or a saying of your own, you could search through quotes that you like from books that you've read or from people that you really admire. I collect a lot of quotes. I use Evernote to collect all kinds of things, but I have a lot of quotes there. Or there are obviously tons of tools. You could just use notes on your phone or whatever you want. But I think that's a really helpful way to maybe even just get some inspiration. Maybe you don't take a direct quote from somebody else, like that Angela Carter quote I mentioned earlier, but maybe it just inspires you to come up with something that is helpful to you. Mm-hmm. And then the next one is to listen to what others find helpful. So going back to some of those sayings that we mentioned from the community, maybe you could listen to some other sewers, ask them, and that might inspire you to come up with something that's really helpful, or it might even help you just to identify a problem that you hadn't realized that you had as well. So that I find that really helpful. And then the next and last tip I have, if you want to adopt a practice like this, it can be really hard just to get into the habit of using a tool like this. I think any kind of like mental health tool, mindfulness tool, I think the hardest part is just kind of adopting it in the beginning. So what I find helpful there is just to keep it really front and center for a little while. Maybe you could print it out and put it above your sewing machine, or, just make a practice of using it every time you go to sew for a little while, just until you kind of get into the habit of using it and it gets imprinted on your brain. I just think that's the hardest part. You might come up with this and think, okay, this is going to be helpful to me. But then the next time that you're stressed out or you're having difficulty, that's a really hard time to actually remember what to do. So I think just kind of developing some kind of initial rules or practice around it can be super, super helpful. So those are my tips. That's just what's been helpful to me in coming up with something like this.
That's awesome. I love those tips. So just to recap a little bit, today we talked about positive affirmations. Positive affirmations are the positive statements that we say to counter those negative thoughts. Beyond that, though, we had a really great discussion just about the way we treat ourselves and self-compassion. Sari shared some really excellent tips for cultivating your own positive affirmation and positive affirmation practice by identifying where you get stuck and the lessons that you need to learn kind of over and over again, and thinking about those things, thinking about what you value about sewing and what you want to live up to. Searching for some quotes that you like that kind of address those values that we talked about earlier. Borrow from others. So hop on to the community, discuss with your friends on Instagram, and just see what other people are saying, because you might be inspired by their affirmations. And then lastly, put your statement into practice by keeping it really central in your life, printing it out, taping it above your sewing machine, and practicing it. Again, a positive affirmation is a tool, and a tool is only useful if we use it. Like my hammer isn't useful unless I use it to bang some nails into something. So if you want to learn a little bit more about this, we're going to link in the show notes to the community thread that Sari started to get this discussion rolling a little bit. You can also check out the book Mindful Self-Compassion by Dr. Kristen Neff. And we're also going to link to an article about the science of positive affirmations, so you can kind of dig into that a little bit deeper if you like. And make sure that if you like this episode, to leave us a review. Tell us your sewing affirmation in the review. And also by reviewing us, then you help other people who love sewing like we do to find us.
Yeah, it's super, super helpful. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for a great discussion today, Haley. This was really fun.
Yeah, I'm feeling energized and more positive already.
Awesome. All right. See you guys later.
Bye.
Bye. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.